Hi, welcome back to Metapunk Zero. I'm Andre, and in this episode, I'm going to be doing another installment of the Psychosis Diaries. This time, we're going to be talking about what the best treatments for psychosis are. Hi, so welcome back. In the last two videos, I talked about what causes psychosis, and I hinted in those videos about what some of the better treatments for psychosis might be. But of course, this merits its own discussion, its own video. And we might as well start by talking about the elephant in the room, which is medication. And medication is the first thing that doctors will give you or talk about when somebody shows up in a psychotic state at a doctor's office or a hospital. And there's reasons for that. We know that there are physiological correlates for any mental health condition. I mean, this is just sort of a scientific fact that the body responds to the mind. Let's put it that way. That you can't have an emotion. You can't get excited without your body reacting to that, right? So that's a thing. But what I think gets confusing, especially for doctors, what medical science gets confused is the idea that the body is the cause. That we get caught up in the idea that psychosis is a chemical imbalance in the brain, or that depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. I talked at length about that in the last video, and maybe too long, I don't know. But I think that's a really important distinction to make, that we made this, that medicine makes this confusion. And it does this for several reasons. I mean, the one thing that has to be said is that sometimes these medications do make a difference. And I'm certainly not telling anybody not to take their medication. I'm not saying to go off your medication or anything like that. I'm not giving any kind of medical advice at all. I'm not a doctor, and I want to be very clear about that. But I'll probably say it in every video where I talk about these things as much as I can. But obviously, you got to be your own guide when it comes to this stuff. You have to do what's best for you. And you have to make your own best decisions based on the best information that you have and your best interests for you, So that said, I am critical of medication, and I'm skeptical about the way that the medical model is used, because the medical model does take medication as pretty much the only, certainly the first line of defense, but usually pretty much the only factor that doctors will talk about, in a medical sense. Is medication. And the thing is that they do work. They do have an effect. They do balance dopamine, on some level, whatever that means, usually by suppressing the dopamine levels in the brain. And because I believe, at least in many cases of psychosis, it's usually there's an overabundance of dopamine in the synaptic gaps between neurons, so that has an effect, but it's a bit of a category mistake to say that that's the cause, and to look at it like it's the only thing. They can help in certain situations to alleviate the immediate symptoms, but they help the same way that a bandage stops bleeding, that they're a Band-Aid solution. They treat the after effect of the emotional distress that created the psychosis in the first place. And so it's a bit of a problem for us, who have gone through it, because a lot of the time the doctor will hit you with a bunch of drugs, and those drugs have side effects. Some of those drugs will destroy your internal organs if you take them for too long. Like if you take them for an extended period of time, like 5 or 10 or 20 years, you might destroy your liver, or other internal organs, or your kidneys or something. Because these drugs are toxic. They're foreign materials. They don't really belong in the body. They're not food. And so they have adverse effects on your body, and they have other psychological effects besides just tamping down dopamine. Like what does tamping down dopamine do? Well, it messes with your motivation. So you're hyper motivated to do particular things. You might get obsessive about shopping or gambling or sex or something. But you might at the same time have decreased motivation to do things. That's something that I experience on the medications that I'm taking. And I am taking medications, and I take them because I'm terrified of what I went through when I didn't take the medication. But I don't take them because I think the medications are particularly good for me. I think the medications are a stopgap at this particular juncture, and maybe the same way that I might need a cast if I had a broken leg, I need some neurological support maybe to get me through this moment. But I certainly, that's not advice that I would give to anybody else. That's nothing that I would say applies to anybody but me. Use at your own discretion or whatever. But these things make me really unmotivated. And it's very hard to get out of bed a lot of the time. Like, a lot of the time I just want to lie around, which is crazy, because before the psychosis, for years before the psychosis, I was hyper-functional. I got a lot of things done. I was very motivated. I was very physically fit. I was very physical and very able to get into flow and very able to get things done and respond to a crisis. I could be in a noisy room and I could sort out all the noise, and I could pick things out and still find my flow. I worked in an industry that was very demanding, high pressure, high stress, lots and lots of distraction, and I was able to navigate it pretty successfully. I wasn't able to navigate the abuse I suffered in that industry very successfully, and that's another issue for another video. But I was able to handle all of that, and I was hyper functional. I was hyper responsible. I cared nothing about, or I cared about nothing more than getting stable work and stabilizing my life. And because I wasn't able to do that, which was something that was very much out of my control, I can't control whether or not I get hired, no matter how many resumes I send out. So because I couldn't control those things, I got even more hyper-functional. And so the problem-solving chemistry of my brain kicked into high gear, and that's dopamine. And so I had too much dopamine in my brain, and I went into psychosis. That would be a medical explanation for what I experienced. And so they give me these medications to keep that under control, so to speak. But that doesn't fix my life. It hasn't gotten me a job, and it actually makes me less motivated to solve the problems that led to the psychosis in the first place. And so that's a problem. Another side effect that I have is I get weight gain. In my first psychosis, which was about 20 years ago, I was on a drug called Zyprexa, and Zyprexa caused me to gain 80 pounds because it made me crave carbs like crazy. And that's what some of these drugs will do. They will create side effects like that. They will weight gain is a major one for the older antipsychotic medications, and that can be a real problem too. It also will mess with your blood sugar, like diabetes can be a side effect, because there's something about your metabolic rate and your consumption of carbs which is related to either dopamine production, or it's somehow related to the symptoms that cause psychosis. So anyway, I got a bit off on a tangent there talking about that, but that's basically what I wanted to say, is that medications are the first thing that doctors will try, because medications do have generally positive effects. It's the first line of defense, but doctors are also medically mandated to prescribe medications as their first line of defense. And so there's a bit of a contradiction, or a bit of a, let's say, an ethical bind here, because like a doctor, like my last psychiatrist told me flat out that if he didn't prescribe antipsychotics to me when I went into the hospital, and if he'd released me and then I'd gone out and hurt myself in some way or caused problems for other people, he could lose his medical license, because medical science, says that drugs are the first and only line of defense. And if he just told me to get a lot more exercise and eat right, then that's not doing his due diligence in terms of medical science, and so he could lose his license for not doing that. So he's mandated to prescribe drugs. And so that's going to be the case for any psychiatrist that you go and see, at least in North America. I don't know what the rules are in Europe, but I would imagine they're much the same in the developed world. And which is also interesting. There's a movie called Crazywise, which I highly advise anybody who's interested in spirituality and psychosis and the overlap between the two. But in that documentary, they refer to a study that found that, I think there was more than one study, but there were studies that found that that your prognosis for recovery from psychosis is much better in the developing world than it is in the developed world. And we'll talk about that further into this video. But that's important to note, because in the West, we have all these advanced medicines, and yet recurrence rates of psychosis are still pretty high. Recovery rates are not good. They will tell people who go off the medications that they have relapsed when they have their symptoms return. But the drugs are also, that your body develops a chemical dependence on them. It's not necessarily an addiction, but it's like if you have a drug that's artificially lowering your dopamine levels, your body is going to try to overproduce dopamine in order to compensate for what the drug's doing, because the body is a homeostatic system. And same with antidepressants and stuff. If you go off antidepressants or antipsychotics suddenly, if you don't wean off those drugs, your symptoms will go through the roof. Like you'll get really weird with serotonin. With the antidepressants, you'll get different symptoms, but with the antipsychotics, you'll get psychosis experiences. And a lot of people say, well, that's just the disorder returning, and it's like, well, is that, or is it just that they went off the drugs and the body, your body couldn't immediately, didn't know, wasn't prepared for that change, basically, and then the dopamine levels skyrocketed because the body was overproducing it. So that's something to know. You have to wean off these medications if you do want to get off them. That should be probably medically supervised. I would suggest, although a lot of doctors aren't even trained in how to wean people off these drugs, because the idea is that you're supposed to be on them for the rest of your life. Like insulin for diabetes, which is just garbage. That's just pharmaceutical corporation sales pitch, basically, and that also is talked about in Crazywise. And you can see, obviously this is the confound. This is, I would say, bad science, because the whole medical industry, because it is an industry and it is for profit in certain places, is heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical lobby. And so they want you taking these drugs, and they want you taking them for the rest of your life. And so they want the medical licensing boards to enforce this, and they don't want people to pursue other alternative medications, alternative treatments, because that would cut into their business model. And so it's really hard to separate the science from the business in this case. And that I see as a problem. That's an additional problem. Not that that should influence anybody's health decisions. Again, do what's best for you. If you need medication, take it. If you believe that that's going to help you, do that. If you don't, then that's something you've got to decide for yourself. But I think it's problematic that the medical community makes medicine the first and basically only treatment available. So what are these other treatments? Because I've talked for half this video about medication. What are the other treatments? Well, we can talk about physiological treatments, relational treatments, and social treatments. So physiologically, the obvious ones are rest, diet, and exercise, and good overall health. We talked in the causes of psychosis about malnutrition or starvation, and about sleep deprivation, and all these things causing psychosis as secondary psychosis. So obviously, if you eat right and you get enough rest and you exercise, then you're going to be in a much better position to deal with these things as they emerge. Things that might cause psychosis in an unhealthy person will skip over somebody who's more healthy, and so that's really important to do. So take care of yourself, that's pretty standard advice, good advice from the beginning of time, certain metabolic conditions, like I said, when I was talking about medication, diabetes and psychosis there's a relationship between diabetes and psychosis, and there seems to be a relationship between between psychosis and carbohydrates. And because they've a lot of people have found, there's been studies on this, that keto diets are very promising for treating psychosis, or at least managing the symptoms. And there's been some studies about that, and I'm gonna link to a couple of videos in the description. And one of those videos, a woman talks about keto diets. She's I believe has schizoaffective disorder. Another YouTuber, and she talks about how keto is really helping her. And so I'll try to link to that in the description. She also made a video, interestingly enough, talking about how a particular study near to her, near her location, that was canceled by the medical community in that area, because the study was looking into keto, and it probably was somebody lobbied against it. Some pharmaceutical company probably lobbied to get this study shut down. So I'll link to that. But that's basically, like eating right, sleeping right, taking care of yourself, that sort of stuff. That's going to go a long way to preventing psychosis and to recovering, once you've been through it. It obviously doesn't do you much good when you're going through it. You can do a lot of push-ups, but, like I certainly did a lot of pacing when I was in psychosis, but that wasn't because I was trying to get healthy. So anyway, we can talk about the relational things, and that's really where I think the bulk of what's promising really helps, because if we talk about psychosis as primary psychosis mainly being a symptom of relational trauma, if it's all this stuff coming up, then obviously relationships and being around loving people are going to really help. We know that isolation, like solitary confinement or extreme isolation, like being in the Arctic or the Antarctic or on a spaceship or whatever for extended periods of time, that along with sleep deprivation and starvation will also create psychosis experiences. And so obviously one of the first causes of psychosis is loneliness. And you can look at this in two ways. You can look at this in a relational way, like people need love. I mean, we need empathy. We need the warmth of human companionship, or even of pets, to sort of offset our own emotional, like to help regulate our own emotions. Because we're social beings, and we are physiologically regulated that way, and we're emotionally regulated through contact with other, like-minded emotional beings, but there's also like just a sense of informational feedback. If you've ever spent any time in a psych ward or visited anybody in a psych ward, there's a real lack of stimulus. And partly that's because hospitals have to fund people, and they stack people up like logs or whatever, because they have to store people somewhere, when they're going through something like this. They have to keep them all in one place the way our culture does. And so you're kind of locked into a ward. So there's budgetary reasons why there's not a lot to do in a psych ward, but it's also because when there's too much distraction, when there's too much information, when there's too much going on in an environment, that's really distracting to somebody who's in psychosis. It's going to be really destabilizing, because part of what you go through in psychosis is your attention. Dopamine is the attention chemical, or it's the task-focused attention chemical. So it's when you solve problems and when you overcome challenges and things like that. When you track creative and exploratory information, or when you're dealing with threat, that all of that stuff involves dopamine, and it involves focused attention. And when you're going through psychosis, one of the things that happens is you get really distractible. You get really distracted by your own internal monologues. You get really distracted by any kind of stimulus in the environment. You start reading meaning into all the things that people are saying and doing around you, and to the events that are going on around you. That has a connection with spirituality, which I'll talk about maybe at the end of this video, but probably in another video. The point is that there's a lack of stimulus, and so isolation really exacerbates that, because if there's not enough stimulus going on in your mind, you lose track of how to regulate yourself. You don't have anything to anchor to attentionally, and so you kind of lose that. And I think psych wards don't do a good job of balancing the level of how much stimulation you need, because if there's not enough to do, then you kind of go squirrely and you lose yourself in your own imagination. And if you have too much to do, you get too distracted and paranoid. So, and I don't know, I mean, there's no perfect solution, but the point is that isolation and loneliness are not good for people. So isolating people in psych wards is also not a good treatment for psychosis. That should go without saying, but obviously the medical community is light years behind when it comes to that. So, or the budgets are, I don't know. Being surrounded by loving family, people who know and understand you and accept you. And this is tricky, because not everybody has a family that accepts them. And not everybody who has a family that accepts them has a family that fully accepts the psychosis or fully understands the psychosis. And that can be a bit of a problem. Psychosis is scary. It's scary to be in. It's scary to witness. It can be really hard for family to show up, like just to show up properly and to receive the fact that their loved one is in psychosis, and be able to grapple with that and be able to be real with that. A lot of the time people will either police it and tell people what they're doing wrong. That borders into abuse. And they'll try to police what's going on, and they'll try to tell people to shut down their symptoms, which is like being in psychosis. You can't, there's no way. You're out of control. Your brain is out of control. Your mind is out of control. You can't control yourself, because that is fundamentally what's going on, is you're not able to regulate your own emotionality and mentality. So it's kind of comical when people try to tell other people to calm down, but that creates conflict. People in psychosis do not react well to conflict or control. That's where aggression can happen, or where extreme fear can happen. People can get really beaten down by the slightest amount of control. One of those two things happens, right? People also get rescuing when it comes to psychosis, so they start to manage the other person's symptoms, and they try to help too much, and that can be really a bit of a bind as well, because that's a form of control, even if it's a softer form of control. And so it's really difficult for family members not to fall into one of those two camps, where they either try to police it, or they try to manage it by rescuing the person, or by trying to save the person from their own symptoms. And then the third way is they can just neglect it. They just try to not talk about it. They just try to avoid the issue completely. And then, that's like emotional neglect. Then that leaves the person in psychosis feeling not managed or controlled, but shut down and alienated. And that's definitely not what you need. You want a family that, you want people that accept you and can accept all of you and accept who you are, and can accept that you're going through this really difficult situation. And again, that's not easy. That's not easy for family. That's not easy for the person going through it either. Of course it's not, but it's not easy for family to do that. But that's really the kind of the royal road to treating somebody in psychosis, is having acceptance and love, and then of course treating the underlying emotional trauma, treating CPTSD, treating any repressed and unmet needs that the person might have emotionally, balancing their empathy with their boundaries, right? We often in psychosis have a problem because we've kept particular parts of ourselves down. There were things that we weren't able to express because we grew up in an environment where that wasn't safe to express, and so those things get pushed down, and often that can be somebody's sense of their own assertiveness, their own agency, or their own sense of desire for what they want in life, and they become too passive, or they become too aggressive, they become too angry, or whatever, right? And so it's all about balance. It's all about this major emotional imbalance. And if the psyche isn't balanced, it's going to teeter into depression, and then eventually into psychosis, or it might have, bipolar disorder is this extremes of mood, and that often is accompanied by psychosis experiences, and I think that this really speaks to the fact that it's all about keeping the brain or the mind in balance. I say the mind because it is all of the mind. It is everything about your mind and body. It's everything about your energetic system. It's everything about your emotions. It's not just the brain, I think that's a real misnomer. And so being able to balance your empathy with your boundaries and your assertiveness is really important, and being able to learn that would also go a long way to helping somebody recover from psychosis, as well as to prevent it in the first place. Because if they're able to speak up for themselves, but also be able to be empathetic and emotionally connected, then they find that it helps to regulate and have balance and all those good things, So to that effect, I want to link another video in the description. This is a video by a man named Lionel Corbett, who is a Jungian psychiatrist, I believe. He's done a lot of research on Jung. He's written books about Jung's philosophy and his psychiatry. And he in this video speaks for about an hour on psychosocial treatments for psychosis, and it's for a society that is dedicated. He's speaking to a society dedicated to the psychosocial treatment of psychosis, which is moving away from the biomedical model that prescribes medication only or primarily, and gets more into this idea of loving acceptance. And there are precursors for this. There was it was a study, but it was also a kind of an experiment. There was a place called Diabasis House in San Francisco for a while, run by a man named John Weir Perry, who Lionel Corbett talks about. He's a bit controversial, John Weir Perry, but for a couple of reasons. But at the same time was able to do this project where he ran a home where people could come and stay who were in psychosis or going through like in the prodromal stages, the beginning stages of psychosis, where they could go and medication was maybe used at a minimal amount, whatever the minimum amount was to just balance the symptoms, or not at all. And people were able, in this loving, accepting environment where people were met for who they are and what they were going through, they were accepted into recovery, and it showed really promising results, and there's been papers written about it, and lots of articles, and Lionel Corbett talks about that in that video, and so I'll link to that. But there's also the open dialogue model, which is a model in I believe it's Finland, where the entire family of a patient in psychosis is brought in, and no treatment happens without everybody being present, the patient, but also their family or their close loved ones, and they go through this process where they kind of unpack, what they're going to do to treat the problem, and what they're going to do in order to deal with all the relational dysfunction that might persist or might have exacerbated the psychosis, and so it's really a treatment model for everybody. It's not just for the person who's going through it, because again, the person going through it is really just sort of the sponge that's absorbed all the toxicity in their environment, or all the disconnects. It's not necessarily that people mean to be toxic or anything like that. I don't want to say that people's families are the bad guy or anything like that, because they're not. We all have our shortcomings, and we all have ways in which we're blind and we're emotionally illiterate. This is why I spoke about emotional literacy. That's another big piece of this relational component. If we had a culture that was more emotionally literate, it would prevent psychosis, and it would treat psychosis better, and it wouldn't put people in cages when they have psychosis. It wouldn't lock people away, and it wouldn't like forcibly medicate people, because that stuff is really toxic. You take away people's autonomy, and you will make their psychosis worse, and that's exactly what mental health systems do. That's exactly what hospitals do. They treat it in exactly the wrong way. It is not an environment in a psych ward, generally speaking. You are not accepted for who you are. You are told that you are experiencing a disorder. That disorder is wrong. That disorder has to be eradicated. And the way to eradicate it is to take medications or else, and sometimes they'll do that by force, with armed security, if they have to. And that's not okay. That's not okay at all. But that's the mainstream model. And then we wonder why people in psychosis end up homeless, why they wander around the streets, often acting aggressive or shouting at people. We have all these problems that are created by the medical model of treating psychosis, which could be alleviated if we just treated people with a little more compassion and acceptance. So a little bit of a soapbox there, but but this is important. And again, I mentioned it in the last video, and I'm going on a little bit long here, but I mentioned in the last video that we live in a community, in a culture that doesn't handle these things well. We live in a very aggressive, very adversarial sort of culture. We call it the dominator culture, in certain circles, because it is a dominator culture. It's a culture that values strength and punishes weakness. It's not a culture fundamentally based on connection or compassion. And it's antagonistic to real community and to real understanding, and that's why we suffer from such a deficit of emotional literacy, because even everything, it's not just that we're ethically compromised when it comes to this. It's not just that our culture is too aggressive and not compassionate enough. It's that our very way of thinking, our very consciousness, our metaphysics, our ontology, our epistemology, our ways of knowing, our philosophical basis for our entire culture is fundamentally aggressive and fundamentally destructive. And the canaries in the coal mine are people like people in psychosis, people with depression, all of these things going through the roof right now in terms of prevalence. That there's an epidemic of depression in the world right now, and it's not a coincidence. It's because the culture is toxic. and that I will say, families do their best. The culture itself is a toxic environment. It's not good for human consumption. And even the word consumption, it's not a fit place for people to live safely unless they're affluent. And that's part of the problem too. The disparity of economics is a real problem. Poverty is a huge cause of psychosis. And so it stands to reason that one of the basic ways to treat psychosis is to make sure that people have enough food and housing and clothing and shelter and medical care that they need to get through these things, and medical care that's enlightened to the fact that emotional literacy is important and is actually compassionate and accepting, not the biomedical model that forces you to take drugs and will punish you if you don't. To make sure all those needs are met, we need money, we need funding, we need a culture that cares enough to actually put enough money into disability programs and social assistance or basic income that actually tracks with the cost of living, because so many people on disability are homeless or don't have enough food, because you can usually pick one or the other. At least where I live, that's the case. I'm at risk for that myself. I have enough money coming in I'm on social support right now. I'm not afraid to admit that. I'm on social support. But I have to find work, because if I don't find work, I might not eat. And as much as I can talk and do these videos, it's very difficult for me to be in a workplace right now. It's very difficult for me to focus and motivate myself. I'm motivated to do these videos because I'm passionate about it, and because I'm sick and tired of dealing with all the misunderstanding around psychosis and around everything that leads to it. And so I can tell you from experience that there is not enough money for me to have both a home and food and pay outstanding bills from that I had credit before I was on disability, from when I wasn't working. And so in order to pay off my debts and do all of these things, I need more money than I'm able to get, and I somehow have to work, even though I can't medically do that yet. So anyway, all of these things, dealing with poverty is one of the surefire ways that we're gonna be able to help people recover from psychosis. If they don't have enough to eat, if they don't have somewhere to sleep, if they're worried about their survival, they're not going to recover very well. It's just that simple. Finally, I want to talk about some spiritual ways of addressing psychosis, and some of those involve mindfulness, yoga, martial arts. Mindfulness can be very helpful. I've talked to people who have used mindfulness to offset their schizophrenia. I was in a mindfulness group years and years ago, long before I had experienced psychosis, and one of the men there was certainly using it, and thought good, like he had really positive experiences with mindfulness in that. You do have to be a little bit careful with mindfulness. I think it's safe to treat mindfulness like a form of medicine. It is medicine. It is powerful. It can unlock things that you might not be ready to unlock. You can do mindfulness and actually experience a Kundalini awakening or a psychosis experience, because sometimes your trauma can come to the surface. And so if you're going to do mindfulness, it is a good tool and it is generally safe, but it is best to practice with somebody who's experienced and who's dealt with these things. Unfortunately, mindfulness is everywhere right now. You can learn mindfulness on an app, and if that works for you, that's great. But you need to be aware of the fact that can maybe unlock your trauma. So it's good to have a teacher who's experienced in that. A lot of Western teachers don't have the experience, so it's best if you even suspect in the slightest that you might have complex trauma, then seek out a meditation teacher who has trauma-informed practices that you can do. Don't just go down to your local Zen temple or whatever and just try to learn mindfulness that way, because you might go and you might go into psychosis, or you might have something like that. So if you have trauma, be careful. Unless it's a trauma-informed Zen temple or whatever. So anyway, just use your judgment on that. Use your discretion. Yoga is really good for dealing with trauma, especially trauma stored in the body. It works out the kinks, so to speak, and so yoga is one of the best alternatives to trauma-based therapies. If you want to do, or like a non-medical route, yoga will help with that. I would definitely caveat that by saying it's certainly not a substitute. Like I gotta say, you know, I'm not a doctor or whatever, you know, like use your best discretion when it comes to your own care, and use the treatments that are available to you, to get the best help you can, you know. And then I would say martial arts helps with all that stuff about boundaries and about assertiveness and that kind of thing, and general physical fitness. And all of these things, because, you know, yoga, mindfulness, any spiritual tradition really is going to be linked with a whole set of lifestyle choices. You know, like yoga has the Ayurvedic tradition. Martial arts, maybe you have the traditional Chinese medicine. You know, acupuncture, energy work, Reiki, you know, all these things can help with both trauma and probably with psychosis as well. I mean, you could say that psychosis is an imbalance in the energy system of the body. So all of these things can kind of help, but all of them fundamentally are leading you back to good physiological, relational, and social health and fitness, you know. So, you know, taking care of yourself is just part of all of that. And so most of the spiritual solutions that you're going to get are just, you know, a complement to that, or point you back in that direction, or they just kind of add to it. So anyway, yeah, I think that basically covers it. I've talked quite at length in this video. Hopefully I've said some meaningful things here. I will just leave with a fundamental question, and that is, you know, I've talked all this time about what's the best treatment for psychosis, and a question I haven't asked yet is it even necessary to treat psychosis? Doctors will tell you yes. As I said, you know, the medical model says that psychosis, if left untreated, will definitely destroy your brain. I don't know if it's a definite thing, but maybe you want to get a medical opinion on that, you know, if you're experiencing something like that. If you have the presence of mind to do that, or if you have somebody you trust who can help you work through your treatment options, you know. But there's also something to be said for the fact that a psychosis experience is the mind's way of resetting itself through trauma, of reorienting itself through trauma. You know, it is the archetypal passage through the underworld, and that comes with all the experience of the underworld. That comes with a harrowing experience of maybe something that's terrible or terrifying. You know, it comes with the transcendent experience of godness and God self and angelic stuff, and being a prophet or being a messenger, or, you know, all these sorts of things. You know, those religious themes happen in psychosis, and it's not a coincidence. You know, it's because and Lionel Corbett talks about this, and Carl Jung talked about this. Carl Jung called this process metanoia. You know, the kind of an opposite of paranoia. You know, so it's not fear, it's metanoia. It's going beyond. It's knowledge beyond. That's what metanoia means, and the knowledge beyond of expanding your consciousness. You know, and so that's very much why a psychosis experience and a Kundalini experience, or a mystical experience in general, can kind of overlap, is because you're dealing with all this archetypal stuff that's coming up, you know. I mean, that's something I didn't mention actually yet, and it bears mentioning, is that one of the ways to treat psychosis is to interact with the archetypes and the themes that are coming up in the person's psychosis, you know. And the doctors won't do that. Psychiatrists won't do that, generally speaking, and that caused frustration for Carl Jung 100 years ago, and it hasn't changed in all this time. Most doctors will not give that any credence at all. But there's not a coincidence, you know, between what your delusions are and what your hallucinations are and what you're going through psychologically. You know, it makes sense. It's like you're dreaming when you're awake, and so there's this whole archetypal process that's going on, where your mind is unraveling all these metaphors in order to try to solve the psychological issue that's got you in such distress, you know. And that means reorienting the psyche. The psyche has been blasted apart, and it's trying to put itself back together in a particular way, hopefully in a more healthy form. And so being able to engage with those metaphors, being able to understand that you know, and I only, you know, in my psychosis, I was aware of this stuff when I was in psychosis. The level of my fear was too high for me to really engage with higher level processing on this stuff, but I was still aware that even my hallucinations were, on some level, they were metaphorical. I knew that I wasn't literally seeing what I was seeing, except I kind of was. It gets very hard to sort out when you're actually in it. But if you're somebody who's witnessing somebody going through psychosis, when they're talking about being Napoleon, they're not just making that up, you know, out of nothing, you know. Maybe they're talking about that because because they've been really belittled all their life, and so they want to, the delusion presents as being somebody important because the psyche is trying to balance itself out. It's trying to make the person feel like they actually matter in life, because maybe they've been neglected or abused in a way that made them feel like they didn't, and similar things like that, like all kinds of delusions. A delusion of persecution. Maybe you've been persecuted all your life. I had a lot of persecutory delusions in my psychosis. I'm still not comfortable calling them delusions, because that persecution was very real to me. It was real in the psychosis, but it was also very real in my history. I was bullied severely growing up, through public and high school. Bullied to no end. I had to walk through the hallways with my head down, trying to keep myself from being noticed too much, because the bullies would pick me out and they would pick on me. And there was reasons for that. There were deeper reasons for that, deeper trauma that was leading me to sort of behave in a way that made me an easy target. But it still doesn't excuse what the bullies did, and it doesn't change the fact that I was definitely, literally, in real life persecuted for many, many years, and have complex trauma from it. And so it makes sense that would show up in my psychosis. And so for anybody who's part of the medical community, or a concerned family member or loved one of somebody who's in psychosis or has been through psychosis, take that in mind. The delusions aren't just crazy. They're not just nonsense, They are meaningful from the standpoint of the psychological issue. They have meaning. They're metaphors. They're like dream images, and that is the best analogy that I can give you to it. They're like dream images, or they're like mythology and religious metaphors, So anyway, with that said, does psychosis really need to be treated? I don't know. Carl Jung believed that if you could give people a loving and accepting environment, and you could kind of coach people a little bit, like coaching's the wrong word, because you're not saying, you go get them, tiger. You're not trying to push somebody through this experience. You want to give space for this person to have this experience in a safe environment. And it's very much like the concept of a psychedelic experience. The set and the setting really matters. Encounters with police or security guards, encounters with forced medication, encounters with locked wards and stern-faced doctors who don't give any empathy to what the person is going through, those are all terrible when you're in psychosis. Those are all the wrong thing to give somebody, to do to somebody in psychosis. Those all feed paranoia. They're all control. They're all about control. They're all about eradicating the symptoms, and by extension, the person going through them, And so that's the wrong way to go. If you give somebody an open, accepting environment, you give them the safety and the support they need to go through this experience safely, then they will quite likely come out the other side. And that's what Diabasis House, and that's what Open Dialogue finds, and that's what a lot of developing, quote unquote, developing cultures find too, because they have closer knit communities, and they have a more accepting environment. They are not antagonistic the way that Western culture is. And so they create a much safer environment with much closer family ties and much more acceptance, where people can just kind of be who they are and go through what they're going through, and have this experience where the psyche reorients itself, puts itself back together, and comes out the other side healthier than before, quite often. And that's quite often what happens, because the psychosis is a transformational experience. It's like being in a chrysalis, and that's where psychosis and spiritual experience overlap. They're maybe not identical, because again, maybe somebody has a psychosis that's so bad they can't go through it, but they have to be able to find out for themselves. They have to be able to have the agency to decide for themselves whether they want to continue with that experience and see through that transformation and be reborn, so to speak. They're a chrysalis becoming a butterfly. That's kind of the emergence of a more expanded self, a healthier ego, after recovering from whatever trauma shook the psyche apart in the first place. So anyway, that's my rant, and I've talked at length about this, but I hope it was informative. Thank you for joining me. Take care.